What episode 2 of Chernobyl is actually doing is shifting the disaster from shock to comprehension. The explosion is no longer the mystery. The core is open. The graphite is confirmed. The radiation levels are no longer theoretical. What changes in this episode is the framing. The catastrophe stops being a malfunction and becomes something closer to war. But it is not a war with visible soldiers or advancing armies. It is a war against something invisible, odorless, intangible. Radiation becomes an occupying force that cannot be reasoned with or negotiated against, and that reframing alters the emotional texture of the story completely. Episode 1 was about denial. Episode 2 is about realization. The tone hardens. Characters begin to understand that the reactor is not simply damaged, it is actively poisoning the continent. The scale of consequence expands from a plant accident to a geopolitical crisis. Radiation drifts toward major population centres. The wind becomes an enemy. The clouds become carriers. The disaster is no longer contained to a building. It becomes atmospheric. And in that transformation, the narrative stops asking whether something happened and starts asking whether humanity can outpace it. Valery Legasov emerges as the embodiment of scientific truth without institutional power. He understands immediately what the exposed core implies. He can calculate the heat. He can estimate the radiation output. He can predict the chain reaction if molten fuel reaches groundwater. But understanding does not translate to command. Legasov must persuade men who outrank him politically. He must convert numbers into urgency. His authority is intellectual, not hierarchical. And the episode carefully demonstrates how fragile that position is within a system structured around rank rather than expertise. What makes Legasov compelling is not that he is emotionally dramatic. It is that he is precise, calm, relentless. He explains consequences in measured terms, yet those consequences are apocalyptic. He represents a form of truth that is empirical and indifferent to ideology. The physics do not care about party loyalty. The half-life of radioactive isotopes does not adjust for political stability. But whether action is taken depends entirely on who has the power to authorize it. Knowledge alone is insufficient. Authority determines survival. Opposite him stands Boris Shcherbina, who initially represents authority without knowledge. He is not a caricature of incompetence. He's a bureaucrat shaped by a system that rewards certainty and decisiveness. At first, he dismisses the severity of the situation. He questions the projections. He treats the scientific warnings as exaggeration. The tension of the episode hinges on whether he will listen, because if he does not, the consequences multiply exponentially. Shcherbina's evolution becomes one of the quiet engines of the episode. The moment he begins to understand the scale of what they are facing, something shifts. Authority starts to align with expertise. But that alignment is hard-won. It requires confrontation. It requires Legasov to articulate the unthinkable, that Europe itself could be contaminated if certain thresholds are crossed. The tension does not come from raised voices. It comes from watching power decide whether to accept reality. Even as firefighters deteriorate physically, even as graphite burns openly, the system still hesitates. Exposure levels are debated. Evacuation is delayed. The bureaucracy functions according to procedure, not urgency. Meetings are held. Committees are consulted. The machinery of governance moves slowly, even when minutes matter. The episode makes clear that institutional inertia is as dangerous as radiation itself. The resistance to truth persists, even when evidence becomes undeniable. This resistance is not always malicious, it is often procedural. There are steps to follow, reports to file, approvals to secure. The system does not pivot easily because it was never designed for agility. It was designed for control. And control requires process. But process becomes a liability in the face of exponential disaster. Every hour spent debating logistics increases contamination. The gap between urgency and bureaucracy widens, and the audience feels that widening has dread. One of the most striking thematic developments in episode 2 is how sacrifice becomes normalized. The impending diver mission is not framed as cinematic heroism. There is no triumphant build-up. Instead, it is presented as arithmetic. If the water beneath the reactor is not drained, steam will trigger another explosion. That explosion will release more radiation than the initial blast. Therefore, 3 men must enter lethal conditions to open valves. It is a calculation. 3 lives weighed against millions. The way the episode presents this choice is cold by design. It avoids melodrama. It avoids swelling music. The volunteers are not mythologized. They are workers asked to perform a task because someone must. The framing strips the event of romanticism and replaces it with inevitability. This is what survival requires. Not glory, not celebration. Just grim acceptance. That tonal choice reinforces the broader thematic argument that disaster management is not about spectacle. It is about compromise with mortality. There is also an undercurrent of moral urgency embodied in the scientific community. The character of Alana Komyuk represents an uncompromising conscience. She pushes against delay. She challenges secrecy. Her insistence contrasts sharply with the state's hesitation. She does not possess command authority, but she possesses clarity. Her presence amplifies the ethical stakes. Waiting is not neutral. Waiting is deadly. Episode 2 also transforms mathematics into suspense. Radiation levels are converted into rems and Roentgens. Projections are measured in megatons. Water contamination is mapped across river systems. These numbers are not abstract. They are narrative devices. Each calculation reveals a worse possibility than the last. The horror escalates through explanation rather than explosion. The audience learns alongside the characters, and that learning is terrifying. Because every clarified detail deepens the crisis. The helicopter crash underscores another theme, that arrogance can be fatal, even when intentions are practical. The state attempts to assert control from above. It drops sand and boron. It deploys military precision. Yet the crash becomes a symbol of institutional overconfidence. The assumption that control can be imposed without full understanding mirrors the original reactor failure. It is not the spectacle of the crash that matters. It is what it represents. Power acting before comprehension. Throughout the episode, solutions feel temporary. Sand and boron may suppress the fire, but they do not eliminate the core. Evacuation protects citizens, but contamination remains. The divers can prevent a steam explosion, but the reactor still burns. Each success postpones a worse outcome. There is no triumphant resolution, only mitigation. By the end of episode 2, hope exists, but it is conditional. Fragile, dependent on further sacrifices yet to be made. The disaster has shifted from chaos to campaign. It is a war measured in half-lives and containment strategies. The enemy cannot be seen, but it can be calculated. And calculation becomes the only weapon available. If episode 1 asked whether truth would be acknowledged, episode 2 asks whether truth will be acted upon in time. The thematic core is no longer denial. It is the cost of delayed alignment between knowledge and power. When science finally speaks clearly, and authority finally listens, the question is not whether catastrophe can be undone, it is whether it can be limited, and that distinction defines the tone of everything that follows. The execution of episode 2 sharpens everything the premiere set in motion, but it does so with remarkable restraint. There are no escalating explosions, no sudden twist designed purely for shock. Instead, the episode tightens its grip by focusing on process, conversation, and consequence. The disaster grows more terrifying not because it becomes louder, but because it becomes clearer. The helicopter sequence stands out immediately, not simply as spectacle, but as commentary. On the surface, it is a dramatic moment. A military helicopter hovers over the burning reactor, attempting to drop sand and boron into the exposed core. It is an image of state power attempting to dominate chaos, but the crash that follows reframes the entire gesture. This is not control. It is proximity to something barely understood. The state assumes it can impose order from above, yet even its tools are vulnerable. The crash is not there to thrill. It is there to remind us that confidence without comprehension is fatal. What makes the scene powerful is its timing. It occurs during a moment when leadership believes they are beginning to contain the crisis. The sand drops suggest progress. The visuals imply momentum. And then the crash interrupts that narrative. It signals that even well-intentioned actions can fail when the scale of danger is underestimated. The disaster resists domination. It does not care about displays of strength. More broadly, the tension throughout the episode does not come from physical catastrophe, it comes from explanation. The most gripping scenes are conversations in offices, on helicopters, in makeshift war rooms. Legasov explains what will happen if the molten core reaches water. He outlines the magnitude of a potential steam explosion. The horror unfolds through language, step by step, calculation by calculation. This intellectual suspense is deliberate. The show trusts the audience to understand stakes without visual exaggeration. Each new piece of information expands the radius of dread. We begin to grasp the cascading consequences. The problem is not static. It evolves. And with every explanation, the possible outcomes become worse. The suspense comes from realizing how narrow the window for prevention truly is. Ulana Komyuk functions as a counterweight to institutional hesitation. She represents scientific urgency unfiltered by political calculation. When she learns about the graphite and the radiation levels, she does not moderate her reaction for the sake of decorum. She pushes. She questions. She demands transparency. In doing so, she embodies the moral argument of the episode. Knowledge is not enough if it remains quiet. Her presence heightens the ethical stakes. The longer officials debate, the more contamination spreads. The longer evacuation is delayed, the more civilians are exposed. Komyuk's impatience is not emotional excess. It is rational response. She understands that waiting is an active choice. And that choice carries consequences measured in lives. The episode also transforms numbers into narrative weapons. Radiation exposure is quantified. Megatons are projected. Water contamination scenarios are mapped across rivers and cities. These figures are delivered calmly, almost clinically. But each number is a threat. The mathematics create inevitability. They strip away ambiguity. The science does not exaggerate, it calculates. That reliance on data grounds the horror. There is no supernatural element, no mysterious force acting without explanation. The danger is measurable, predictable, and that makes it more disturbing. Because once the math is understood, the consequences become unavoidable unless drastic action is taken. The numbers do not scream, they simply accumulate. Sacrifice in this episode is framed as logistical necessity. The diver mission is introduced not with fanfare but with analysis. If the water remains beneath the reactor, a second explosion is possible. That explosion would release unimaginable levels of radiation. Therefore, the water must be drained. And to drain it, men must enter lethal conditions. The reasoning is straightforward, brutal, unsentimental. What makes this framing so effective is the absence of cinematic glorification. The volunteers are not elevated into myth. They are asked a question. They answer. There is no swelling orchestration of bravery, only acknowledgement of risk. The episode treats their decision as grim arithmetic. 3 men against millions of potential casualties. The emotional impact comes from the quiet acceptance of that equation. Hope, when it appears, is conditional. The sand drops may suppress the fire, but they do not eliminate the core. Evacuation may reduce exposure, but contamination has already begun. The divers may prevent a steam explosion, but the reactor remains unstable. Each solution feels like a pause rather than a victory. The narrative refuses to suggest that the crisis is under control. It is being managed, not conquered. By the end of episode 2, the disaster has transformed into an ongoing campaign against physics and time. The state begins to mobilize. Scientists gain partial influence. Authority listens more closely. But the threat remains immense. The episode closes not with triumph, but with postponement. The worst-case scenarios have been delayed, not erased. And that is the execution's greatest strength. It resists the comfort of resolution. It understands that real disasters do not end cleanly. They evolve. They require compromise. They demand sacrifice. Episode 2 builds tension not through spectacle, but through comprehension. The more the characters understand, the more terrifying the situation becomes. And in that understanding lies the true weight of the story.